Okay, we're looking at Romans chapters 1 through 3. The first question says, summarize the failures of the Gentiles according to chapter 1. Chapter 1 has some introduction material, but then going to verse 18 on through the end of the chapter and then a little bit into chapter 2, there's a focus on the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people of history, at least from this point here in Paul's reference. It says, the wrath of God in verse 18 is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. One of the most important points here is in verses 19 and 20. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And so the Gentiles here are said to have known about God. They are said to have had a revelation of God. He revealed himself to them through the things that he created. Even though they couldn't see him, the invisible qualities of him were hidden from them, of course, but he revealed himself to them through the things that had been made. However, verse 21, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks unto him. And then he continues to list the results of their rejection. Because they rejected God, verse 24 says, therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. And continues on to list many terrible sins that they committed as a result of God giving them over to these sinful desires. So their failure, there are many failures, of course, on them, but one of the primary failures is there in the first part of the passage, verse 18. It says that they suppress the truth, and particularly the truth of God's revelation of himself to them through nature. They suppress this truth by their wickedness, and because they refuse to accept that truth, because they refuse to hold on to this truth of God, he gave them over to the sinful desires of their heart, and they did all manner of evil things. The second question is to summarize the failures of the Jews according to the chapter. So in contrast to Gentiles, we have the Jews in chapter 2. And what is the failure of the Jew? In verse 17, we have now you. If you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed of the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in dark, an instructor of foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. These verses here describe the state of the Jews. The last part there, they had in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Whereas the Gentiles did not have a direct revelation of God, they had nature to look to understand the things of God. The Jews had the explicit and direct revelation of God from the law given to them through Moses and from Mount Sinai. So they have the law. This is both the moral law as well as the ceremonial law, all of the instruction that God gave through Moses. In that law was the embodiment of knowledge and of truth. But where did they fail? Verse 21, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? So they knew, they had the embodiment of knowledge and truth. They knew you should not be stealing. And they're telling others, according to the law, you should not be stealing. However, he's saying, do you steal? You who say people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? The primary problem here is what we refer to as hypocrisy. They knew what was right. Not only did they know it, they taught and told others what was right, told others what was wrong, but they themselves did not walk in accordance with what was right. Going down in verse 26, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? And verse 27, the one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. So the failure here of the Jews is that they have the embodiment of knowledge and truth. They know what God's will is more clearly than the Gentiles. They profess it. They profess to even walk in it, but they don't walk in it. They're doing it maybe externally, but internally, they're neglecting the deeper and more weightier matters of the law. So we have the Gentiles who explicitly reject God. They say we will not keep God in our knowledge. We will not acknowledge him, though he has revealed himself. The Jews, on the other hand, they profess to accept God. They claim that they are walking in his ways. However, though they are telling people you should not steal, they themselves are stealing. They tell people you should not commit adultery, but they are committing adultery. So we see hypocrisy on their point. But both of them together, we see the same sin. We see the sin of rejecting the knowledge of God, rejecting the truth of God, whether explicitly or implicitly. Both refuse to acknowledge God and follow his ways, I should say. Jesus, in John chapter 3, talking to Nicodemus, he also gives kind of a summary of the failure of all humanity. This is John chapter 3, and reading verse 19, he says, "This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil." That light can be the truth according to the law that the Jews received. That light could also be the truth according to creation that the Gentiles received. But Jesus is saying light has come into the world and men love darkness. They refused the light. They refused to acknowledge God. In verse 20, "Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed." This is the sin of the world. I'm sure you personally, like me, can relate to this. Some truth comes to you in whatever format. Someone says that that's not the best way that God would have you to live. You hear it from a sermon. You hear it from reading the Bible. You just know it in your mind. You just have an understanding of what's right. But we have the inclination to reject what is God's truth. We have the inclination to say, I want to do it my way. We have the inclination to, just like Eve, say, God says don't eat the fruit, but it says when she saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a tree desirable to make one wise. She said, God says it this way, I'm going to do it my way. All of us have that inclination. And as Paul sums up in chapter 3 here, verse 10, "As it is written, there is no one righteous, no, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They are all altogether become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one." And this applies both to Jews and Gentiles. Verse 9, he says, "We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles all alike are under sin." And in verse 23 of chapter 3 again, we have this very popular verse, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And what he's emphasizing here is that just because the Jews have the truth, because they're aware more acutely of what God desires, that doesn't make them inherently better than those who don't, because they're still not following it. And I think we as Christians and just in general, we need to hold on to this truth, because though we look down our nose at the atheist, we look down our nose at the Muslim, we look down our nose at the Buddhist, at the others who don't have the light of Christ, who don't have the truth, it could be that we're in the same situation as the Jews, that we are professing the truth. We are calling ourselves instructors of the babes and instructors of the unwise. But are we keeping the law? Are we keeping the truth? Are we walking in harmony? Have we rejected the truth as they? Because again, that of itself, to summarize it, this particular point here in chapter 2, Paul says, verse 13, "For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous." It's not those who are Christians and not Muslims. It's not those who are Christians and not Hindus. Not because you've heard the law, that doesn't make you righteous. Those who are righteous are those who obey the law. And that obedience of the law is not just externally. Verse 29 emphasize that. "No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly. And circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God." The emphasis here is, again, the Jew, though he may know better, even if he's only doing better externally, he is not better than the atheist. He is not better than the Buddhist. The will of God is that our hearts, that the inside be clean. And that inside being clean shows itself on the outside. And so again, even if we believe externally, we're doing the things that the Bible requires, we're doing what God has asked, what's going on in the inside? What is motivating us? The last part of that verse, verse 29, such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. Are we before God walking in harmony with his truth? Have we accepted and do we follow his truth in our hearts, in our attitudes towards people, in our motivation, the things that guide us in what we do, in our honesty? Are we sincere with God and sincere before men? These are the things that God is seeking. And the charge of Paul is that no, not one. All of us have sinned and all of us fall short. And none of us then can be called righteous by our own selves. None of us can be called righteous because we walk in whole, complete harmony with God's will. The good news, however, the gospel, is that this is not the kind of righteousness that we're dependent upon for our salvation. The next question goes into this. Give at least 3 aspects of the righteousness that has been made available to us. And this starts in chapter 3, verse 21. But now, a righteousness from God apart from law has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. The 3 aspects of the law, of this righteousness, are that first, it's from God. It's the righteousness of God. It's not a righteousness that I can earn or create of myself. It's from God. Secondly, it's separate from the law. This is not righteousness that anyone can earn by obedience or adherence to any law. And lastly, verse 22 says, this righteousness is from God. It comes through faith. We'll be looking more in the next video on chapter 4 of Romans. We'll be looking at what that means, that this righteousness is from faith, is of faith.